The wind cut sharp across the dry plains that bordered the little American village, carrying with it the bitter scent of wood smoke and dust. The streets were narrow and unpaved, lined with weathered buildings that had been standing since the first settlers raised them decades before. Horses stamped their hooves against the cold dirt, harnesses creaking as wagons rolled slow and heavy past the general store and blacksmith shop. The late 1800s were not kind to the weak, and everyone who lived here knew survival often depended on hard work, loyalty, and luck. Yet behind the doors of a small, sagging farmhouse on the edge of town, a girl's quiet battle for survival had nothing to do with droughts, winters, or wild cattle. Her greatest hardship lived under the same roof. She was small for her age, with shoulders that hunched not from nature but from habit, as though she were always bracing for a blow. Her hands were calloused from scrubbing floors and kneading dough, her nails cracked from hours in the cold washtub. Each chore was watched with sharp eyes, and every mistake, no matter how slight, was met with cruel words and tighter rations. The woman who should have been her guardian, who had stepped into her father's home after her mother's passing, treated her less like a child and more like an unwelcome burden. Bread was withheld if a floor wasn't spotless. Soup was thinned until it was nearly water if a shirt wasn't mended neatly. And when the girl tried to hide her hunger, her stepmother would notice the hollow cheeks and smile in a way that carried no warmth at all. The village folk whispered, as they always did. They saw the girl's pale face at church, the way her dress hung too loose around her thin frame. They wondered why she never lingered after service like the other children, why she hurried home without tasting the pies laid out at socials or the stews simmering in neighbors' kitchens. But in a town where every family was fighting to make ends meet, people told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. Hardship was everywhere, and not every hardship was meant to be shared. Out on the far edge of the valley, where the land opened wide into acres of dry pasture, a widowed rancher carried his own burdens. His hands were scarred from rope burns and branding irons, his face lined deeper than his years. He had 3 children to raise on his own, children who still looked for their mother in the quiet corners of the house. He worked long hours under the sun, breaking horses, mending fences, hauling feed, always with the sound of small voices waiting for him at home. Life was a weight he bore without complaint, but even a strong man could not ignore the hollowness that settled in his home. When night fell and no gentle hands lit the lamps or smoothed the blankets over restless little ones, the rancher passed through town often, trading beef or buying flour and coffee. More than once, he noticed the girl standing outside the general store, a basket in her arms, eyes lowered as if the ground were safer to look at than the world around her. Something about the way she clutched that basket half empty, never full, struck him. He thought of his own children, cheeks round and bellies filled after supper, and he wondered why the girl before him always looked as though she hadn't tasted a proper meal in weeks. He did not speak then. In those days, a man had to tread carefully before meddling in another household's affairs. But the thought of her stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. As autumn deepened, the air grew colder, and the girl's hunger worsened. Chores stretched from before sunrise until long after dark, and her stepmother seemed to grow sharper with each passing day. One evening, after a spilled bucket of water soaked the kitchen floor, the punishment was swift and merciless. The girl was sent to bed without supper, her stomach twisting, the sound of her stepmother's satisfied footsteps echoing in her ears. She pressed her face into the pillow, trying to imagine the taste of bread, the warmth of stew, anything to keep the ache at bay. The next morning, while smoke curled from chimneys across the village and families gathered at their tables, the girl walked the dirt path toward town with her basket once more. The air was crisp, her breath clouding before her, and her knees felt weak from the emptiness inside her. She paused near the mercantile, where wagons rattled and men shouted greetings, and for a moment she swayed on her feet. It was then that the rancher, passing by with a sack of feed slung over his shoulder, caught sight of her again. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that glance was something unspoken, his recognition of her frailty, her silent plea for relief. He had seen calves starved of milk, colts left too weak to stand. He knew the look of hunger when it carved itself deep into flesh and bone. The sight of it on a child was something he could not set aside. His hand tightened on the feed sack, and for the first time he stepped closer. "Did you eat this morning?" His voice was low, roughened by years in the saddle. The girl shook her head. Words stuck fast in her throat. Behind her, the stepmother's shadow fell long across the dirt, her eyes sharp as ever. The rancher noticed the way she looked at the girl like a hawk guarding prey it intended to keep. His jaw tightened. He thought of his own children waiting at home, bowls of porridge already cooling on the table. And he wondered what kind of woman could deny such a simple gift as food to the child in front of him. The girl's stomach growled softly, the sound almost drowned by the noise of the street, but the rancher heard it. He hesitated only a moment, then shifted the sack to his other shoulder and gestured toward the bakery across the way. The smell of warm bread drifted on the breeze, sweet and rich, enough to make her knees buckle. "Come," he said, though he knew the stepmother's eyes burned hot against his back. The girl's heart pounded, torn between obedience to the woman who ruled her home and the desperate ache that gnawed her insides. She took one small step forward, then another. The rancher opened the door to the bakery, the golden light spilling out onto the cold street. For the first time in weeks, she felt the stir of hope, faint and trembling, but real yet, as the warm scent of bread wrapped around her. The stepmother's voice cut sharp across the air. "Where do you think you're going?" The bakery door stood open, the rancher waiting, the girl caught in between. Her hunger pulled her one way, fear the other. And in that instant, with the village folk glancing over their shoulders and the morning sun climbing higher, the choice before her seemed as heavy as the world itself. Would she step inside and claim the kindness offered, or retreat back into the shadows where hunger and cruelty waited? The answer hung in the air, unspoken. As the village seemed to hold its breath, the girl froze at the sound of her stepmother's voice. The bakery door opened in front of her, but the woman's command anchoring her to the cold ground. The rancher kept one hand on the doorframe, his eyes steady on the child. He didn't speak, not yet. He knew one wrong word could send her running back to the place she had just escaped. Around them, villagers pretended not to watch, though many did. They whispered to themselves, adjusting hats or shifting baskets. Sensing a moment worth remembering, the stepmother walked forward, her boots striking the dirt with sharp, deliberate steps. She held her chin high, as though daring anyone to challenge her. The girl's shoulders bent low as she stood between the woman and the rancher, her fingers twisting the edge of her faded dress. The smell of warm bread floated out from the bakery, and it seemed to cling to her like a promise she could not reach. "Get back here," the stepmother snapped, her voice firm enough to cut through the hum of wagon wheels and chatter. The rancher's jaw clenched, but he did not move. His 3 children needed him to choose his battles wisely. Still, something inside him rebelled at the sight of a child so hungry, so frightened, being denied what was most natural in life. He studied the stepmother's face, searching for any softness, but found only tight lips and narrowed eyes. The girl turned her face toward the ground as though waiting for permission. No one gave it. Not her stepmother, not the rancher, not the villagers who stood nearby and pretended to care only about their errands. With a trembling breath, she stepped back from the bakery door, her hunger forced once again into silence. The rancher let the door close slowly, the warmth of the bakery spilling back inside. He watched her retreat, her head bowed, her stepmother's, hand gripping her arm with a force that spoke more than words. That night, Rancher sat by the fire in his ranch house. His children gathered around him. The flames cast shadows across the walls, and the sound of the wind pressed hard against the windows. He should have been listening to the children's chatter, but his thoughts lingered on the girl in town. He pictured the way her thin frame had swayed in the cold morning, the hollow look in her eyes. His children had gone to bed with bellies full of cornbread and stew. Somewhere across the village, that child had gone to bed with nothing at all. The girl lay on her straw mattress, in the small room that had once belonged to her mother. The quilt was worn thin, and the chill of autumn seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Her stomach ached, but worse than the ache was the memory of the bread she had nearly tasted. She closed her eyes and imagined the rancher's voice, calm and steady, asking if she had eaten. No one else had asked her that in so long. She held on to the sound of it until sleep finally carried her away. Days passed, each one much the same. Chores stretched endlessly. The stepmother's gaze never softened. The girl learned to hide her hunger as best she could, stealing crumbs when they fell, drinking water to quiet her stomach. But each time she went into town, she felt the rancher's eyes on her. He did not speak again, not with the stepmother always near, but his silence carried weight. It was the silence of a man who had noticed, who would not easily forget. Whispers began to move through the village. A woman at the mercantile mentioned to another that the girl looked worse each week. A farmer at the blacksmith's muttered that the rancher had seemed ready to intervene. Some said it wasn't their place, that families kept their own ways. Others said it was shameful to let a child suffer so openly. No one said anything to the stepmother's face. But the looks that followed her grew colder. The rancher felt the tension whenever he came to town. He had enough troubles of his own, but something about this girl pressed against his conscience. He remembered his late wife, how she had never allowed a child to leave her table hungry, even if it meant she went without. He remembered her voice, telling him that kindness was not something you offered when convenient, it was something you lived by. That memory sat heavy on him now. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in red and gold, the rancher was out mending a fence. When his oldest boy came running from the house, "Pa, there's someone at the gate." The rancher straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. At the gate stood the girl, her small frame trembling, her eyes wide with fear and hope all at once. She clutched her basket against her chest as if it were armor. For a long moment, neither spoke. The boy looked from his father to the girl, uncertain what to do. The rancher walked slowly toward the gate. His boots crunched against the dry earth, and the girl's eyes filled with tears she could not blink away. He opened the gate just enough to stand in front of her, keeping his voice quiet. Did something happen? She swallowed hard but did not answer. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Behind her, the sky darkened, and the sound of distant wolves echoed from the hills. The rancher studied her face, seeing more than hunger now. He saw fear, deeper and sharper than before. Whatever had driven her out this far was more than an empty stomach. He wanted to ask more, but he knew the wrong question might send her running. "Come inside for a bit," he said gently, though he could almost hear her stepmother's fury if she discovered this. The girl shook her head, stepping back. Her eyes darted toward the road as though she expected someone to appear any moment. She hugged the basket tighter, her knuckles white. Then, without another word, she turned and fled, her small figure disappearing into the twilight. The rancher stood still, the open gate before him, the unanswered questions heavy in his chest. His boy tugged at his sleeve. "Pa, why was she here?" The rancher didn't answer. He didn't know yet, but he did know one thing. Something was unraveling in that girl's life, and it was drawing her closer to his world whether he asked. For it or not, that night, sleep did not come easily. The rancher sat awake long after his children had gone to bed, staring into the dying fire. He thought of the girl's eyes, how they had carried both desperation and determination. He thought of the stepmother's shadow stretching long across the dirt road that morning by the bakery. He thought of how quickly a life could turn when no one stepped forward to offer kindness. Across the village, in the farmhouse on the edge of town, the girl sat awake as well. Her stepmother's scolding still echoed in her ears, sharper than usual, crueler than usual. She had been sent to bed with no supper once again. But this time, the hunger was matched by something else, an ache for escape. A longing for the warmth of the rancher's fire she had glimpsed from the road. She had gone as far as his gate and no further. But she knew the thought of turning back empty would not leave her. The wind howled outside both their homes, carrying the dust of the plains and the secrets of the village. Somewhere between the two households lay a path neither had chosen, but both were being drawn toward. The girl's hunger would not fade. The rancher's conscience would not rest. And the stepmother's grip would not easily release. As the nights grew longer and winter crept close, the tension in the village thickened. Folks kept whispering, and the rancher kept watching. The girl kept shrinking. Yet something inside her began to grow a quiet defiance that even her stepmother could not stamp out. And though no one yet knew it, the moment was fast approaching when silence would no longer be enough, when hunger, cruelty, and kindness would collide in a way that would change every life bound to that little village on the edge of the plains. Snow fell late that year, but when it came, it blanketed the valley in silence. The roofs of the village sagged under the weight of it, fences groaned, and the sound of sleigh bells replaced the rattle of wagon wheels on frozen dirt. For most families, winter meant drawing closer, keeping the fire stoked and food stretched. But for the girl, the cold was another punishment layered onto her days. Her stepmother rationed every crumb as if kindness cost more than flour. She watched her stepson eat heartily at the table while her own plate was little more than scraps. The girl would sit quietly, her fingers curled tight in her lap, the ache of hunger gnawing so deep it became part of her. The rancher had noticed her worsening state whenever she came to town. She no longer hurried past him. Instead, her pace had slowed, each step heavy, her basket often empty on the way back. Once he saw her pause at the well, her hand gripping the wooden post as if she might faint. He wanted to offer help, but the sharp presence of the stepmother always lingered near, watching like a hawk ready to strike. His own children had begun asking about her. The oldest boy remembered the day she stood at their gate, her eyes full of fear. The younger ones whispered about her when they thought he wasn't listening, wondering why she looked so thin, why her dresses hung so loose. The rancher tried to hush them, but the questions only echoed what his own heart was already asking. One evening, a neighbor stopped by the ranch to trade firewood for beef. Over supper, he mentioned the girl without meaning to. "That child don't look well," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen her carrying buckets heavier than she is. Folks say her stepmother's stricter than most, but stricter ain't supposed to mean starving a child." The rancher said nothing, only nodded, but his mind churned long after the neighbor had left. Stricter, that word didn't sit right. Strictness. Was a father teaching his sons to mend a fence straight, or a mother making her daughters sew neat stitches? Starvation wasn't strictness, it was cruelty. The girl's stepmother, however, seemed blind to the whispers. She strutted through the mercantile with her chin high, ignoring the glances, speaking only when she wished. Behind closed doors, her voice was sharper. She reminded the girl at every turn that she should be grateful for a roof. That food was earned, not given. She told her she was clumsy, useless, always one mistake from losing even the little she Had the girl listened in silence, but inside her chest a quiet flame began to flicker. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it was something stronger than despair. That flame grew each time she thought of the rancher's children. She had glimpsed them at church, rosy-cheeked and lively, their father's hand resting steady on their shoulders. She had seen them play in the yard when she passed the ranch road, laughter echoing over the pasture. She wondered what it would be like to belong to such a home, where the worst punishment might be an extra chore, not an empty stomach. That thought fed her when bread did not. The rancher, meanwhile, felt the pull of conflict each day. His duty was to his children, to the land, to the cattle that demanded endless work. But the memory of his late wife haunted him more in winter than in any other season. She had believed fiercely in protecting the vulnerable. If she were here, she would not have stayed silent. He could almost hear her voice urging him to act, and yet he hesitated. In a small village, stepping into another family's matters could breed enemies. He knew the stepmother had a sharp tongue and a willingness to wield it. But could he truly watch the girl waste away while he said nothing? As weeks passed, the snow thickened, and with it came more signs of strain. The girl began showing up in town alone, sent on errands her stepmother did not wish to make herself. Her shoulders bent lower under the weight of baskets and buckets. Once, she slipped on the icy path outside the mercantile, and though she scrambled to her feet quickly, the rancher saw the bruise blooming on her cheek. He asked her softly if she was hurt, but she only shook her head and hurried on, the fear in her eyes silencing her tongue. That bruise was the talk of the village for days. Some believed she had fallen. Others whispered darker possibilities. But whispers were all they remained. No one came to her aid, not truly. People told themselves it was not their place, not their fight. Subplots wove quietly beneath the surface of the main conflict. One involved the rancher's eldest son, who had begun sneaking out after supper to leave little things by the path: an apple, a crust of bread, sometimes even a jar of milk. He never said it was for her, but everyone in the house knew. The rancher did not scold him, though he worried what would happen if the stepmother discovered. Another thread unfolded with the local preacher who had noticed the girl's thinness each Sunday. He began to wonder if a sermon on mercy and kindness might stir the village to action. Yet he hesitated to, knowing words in a sermon could be twisted into offense if a family believed themselves accused. So he prayed quietly instead, waiting for courage or for a sign. The girl herself carried her own subplot, hidden from everyone. Each night, when the house was dark, she kept a tiny stash of crusts she had managed to save, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and the act of keeping it gave her strength. She imagined herself clever for it, as though each crumb she saved was proof. She could endure what was meant to break her. The stepmother grew harsher as winter pressed on. Food was scarcer, patience thinner. She accused the girl of being lazy, of not working hard enough, though no one in the household worked more. She tightened her grip, forbidding her from lingering in town, watching her more closely when they did errands together. The more the girl tried to disappear, the more the stepmother seemed determined to remind her of her place. The rancher watched from a distance, each encounter deepening the knot in his chest. He saw the way the girl shrank when spoken to, the way she kept her eyes lowered. He also saw the way her eyes flickered with something else when they landed on his children, a yearning she could not hide. That look unsettled him. Not because it was wrong, but because it told him her spirit had not been broken entirely. And that meant she might still find a way to survive. Someone gave her the chance. The conflict spread like cracks in ice. The stepmother felt the village turning colder toward her, though no one spoke outright. She began to suspect the rancher's gaze, the preacher's prayers, the whispers in the mercantile. This only fueled her bitterness, and the girl bore the brunt of it behind closed doors. The girl's hunger deepened, her body weaker, but her will quietly hardened. She began to wonder if she could run, though the snow made escape treacherous. Still, the thought circled her mind each night as she lay awake. Listening to the wind rattle the boards of the farmhouse, the rancher lay awake too, staring at the ceiling beams of his own home, wrestling with the voice of his late wife in his memory. His children slept soundly in their beds, never having known true hunger. He asked himself what it would take for him to finally act, and whether waiting would mean he was too late. The girl's secret stash under the floorboard had grown thin. The snow outside showed no signs of melting, and the stepmother's anger grew sharper each day. The villagers watched, the rancher worried. The girl endured, and somewhere beneath it all, the clash between cruelty and compassion pressed closer to breaking point. Though no one yet knew which side would win when the moment finally came, winter deepened, and with it came a silence that weighed heavy over the little village. The snow no longer fell gently, but in storms that buried fence posts and drifted high against doors. The air bit at the skin, sharp as knives. And each morning, people rose to stoke their fires and pray the food in their cupboards would last. For the girl, the cold was merciless, but hunger was worse. Each day she grew thinner, her hands trembling as she carried buckets of water or scrubbed the wooden floors. Her stepmother's words were as sharp as the wind, slicing deeper than any frost. She told her she was worthless, clumsy, undeserving of even a crust. The girl never answered back, but inside her chest something wound tighter with every cruel word. The villagers could no longer ignore what they saw. At church, the girl's dress hung so loosely it looked borrowed from someone twice her size. Her eyes seemed too large for her face, her skin pale as snow. Mothers whispered among themselves, fathers frowned, children stared. Still, no one stepped forward. In a place where every family was bound by its own rules and pride, interference carried a heavy price. And yet, the weight of silence pressed. Heavier with each week, the rancher felt it most of all. Each time he passed her in town, the memory of his late wife's voice grew louder in his mind. She had never let injustice sit unchallenged, and he knew she would not forgive him for watching quietly while a child wasted away. His children noticed too. The eldest left food at the roadside whenever he could, but even that small kindness felt dangerous. More than once, the rancher feared the stepmother might discover the offerings and punish the girl worse for them. The tension in the village stretched thin, like a rope pulled taut. It showed in the preacher's eyes when he looked at the girl during service. It showed in the way the blacksmith paused his hammer when she walked by, shaking his head. It showed in the way the rancher's neighbors lowered their voices when her name came up. Everyone saw, everyone knew. And yet the girl remained trapped in the cold shadow of her stepmother's house. Then came the night of the great storm. Wind howled through the valley with a fury that shook windows and ripped shingles from roofs. Snow pounded the earth, swallowing paths and fences, burying wagons in white. Families huddled close to their fires, listening to the storm rage like an angry beast outside their walls. In the small farmhouse on the edge of town, the girl shivered under her thin quilt. The fire in the hearth had burned down low, and her stepmother had gone to bed without sparing another log. The girl's stomach was empty again, the ache sharper than ever, but it was the cold that bit deepest. She curled tighter beneath the quilt, her teeth chattering, her eyes wide open in the darkness. At the ranch, the storm rattled the windows, but the fire burned bright. The children were safe, their bellies full, but the rancher could not rest. He sat by the flames, his mind returning again and again to the girl. He pictured her thin frame, her hollow cheeks, the bruises he had seen bloom on her skin. he thought. Of her standing at his gate weeks before, her eyes pleading, though her lips said nothing. And as the wind roared outside, he realized he could no longer wait. Something had to change, storm or no storm. When morning broke, the storm had left the valley buried. The village stirred slowly, people digging paths through the snow, feeding livestock that bleated weakly from their pens. The rancher saddled his horse and made his way into town, the snow crunching under hooves, his breath rising in clouds. He told himself he was only going to check on neighbors to see if anyone needed help, but his heart pulled him toward the edge of town, toward the small farmhouse where the girl lived. What he found there struck him harder than the storm. The girl was outside, struggling to carry a bucket of water through snow nearly up to her knees. Her face was pale, her hands bare and raw from the cold. She stumbled, nearly falling, and for a moment she just stood there, swaying as though she had no strength left. The rancher dismounted quickly, striding through the snow to take the bucket from her hands. "You'll freeze out here," he said, his voice low but firm. Her lips parted as though to answer, but before she could, the farmhouse door slammed open. The stepmother stood framed in the doorway, her eyes flashing with anger. "She doesn't need your help," the woman snapped. "Go on back to your own affairs, rancher. We manage well enough here." The rancher's jaw tightened, his hands still gripping the bucket. He wanted to argue, to demand an explanation for why the girl looked as she did. But the girl's wide eyes begged him silently not to speak. He let out a slow breath, handed her back the bucket, and stepped away. Yet the image of her trembling hands stayed with him as he mounted his horse and rode off. Word of the storm and the struggles it brought spread quickly through the village. Families shared food where they could. Neighbors helped dig one another. Out, yet whispers about the girl grew louder still. Some said she wouldn't last the winter. Others said the rancher would step in soon. The preacher prayed harder. The blacksmith muttered louder, but still no one acted. The girl, meanwhile, grew more desperate. The crumbs she had hidden under the floorboard were gone. Her stepmother's punishments harsher, her meals smaller. At night she lay awake, listening to the storm's echo in the wind. Her mind turning to the rancher's fire, the warmth she had glimpsed once from the road. She thought of the bread she had nearly tasted, the kindness in his eyes. And though fear kept her rooted, hunger whispered of escape. One afternoon, when the snow had begun to melt slightly, the girl was sent to town alone again. Her basket was light in her hands, and her steps dragged with exhaustion. The rancher saw her from across the street. She stopped at the well, her knees buckling, the basket slipping from her grasp. He was at her side in moments, steadying her. Before she could fall, "You can't go on like this," he said, his voice rough with frustration. She shook her head quickly, eyes darting toward the road where her stepmother might appear. "Please," she whispered so softly he almost didn't hear. "Don't." The single word struck him deeper than any plea for help. Don't. Draw attention. Don't make it worse. Don't risk what little safety she still had. He felt the weight of it, the impossible choice between silence and salvation. That night, as the rancher sat by the fire, he felt his resolve harden. He could no longer look at his children, safe and well-fed, without seeing her thin frame shivering in the snow. He knew the risks, knew the stepmother's fury, knew the way the village might turn on him for interfering. But he also knew a line had been crossed. The girl's eyes had begged him not to act, but her body cried out for someone too. The stage was set for something that could not be undone. The stepmother's cruelty had pushed too far. The girl's endurance stretched too thin, the rancher's conscience too heavy to ignore. The villagers whispered more openly now. The preacher spoke of mercy in sermons that cut sharper than before. The blacksmith shook his head and said it plain. That child won't survive another season. And so the air in the village thickened. With waiting. Waiting for someone to act. Waiting for the stepmother to strike again. Waiting for the rancher to decide whether he would keep silent or step forward. Each glance, each whisper, each sermon built the tension higher. The girl lay awake at night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could endure. The rancher sat by his fire, staring into the flames, wondering how much longer he could hold back. And the stepmother, though she sensed the shifting eyes of the village, clung tighter to her control, determined that no one would take what she believed was hers. The storm had passed, but another storm was gathering in silence, heavier than snow, darker than clouds. It pressed down on every soul in the valley, drawing them toward a moment that none could avoid. The girl's hunger, the rancher's conscience, the stepmother's cruelty, all were on a collision course, and as winter crept toward spring, the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the breaking point that would decide everything. The breaking point came quietly, not with a shout or a storm, but with a moment that could no longer be ignored. It was a market day when the snow finally began to thaw. Villagers carried baskets filled with what little winter had spared, bartering potatoes for beans, flour for candles. The rancher had come with his eldest son, leading a wagon of goods to trade. He did not expect the moment to arrive then, but sometimes fate has its own timing. The girl staggered into the square, carrying her stepmother's basket. She was thinner than ever, her cheeks hollow, her lips pale. The villagers saw it all at once, though they had seen it many times before. This time, though, she faltered. Her knees gave way, and she crumpled onto the frozen ground, the basket spilling potatoes into the slush. For a breath, no one moved. Then the rancher crossed the square in long strides, his son following close behind. He lifted her gently, her weight frighteningly light in his arms. Kay carried her into the mercantile. Her stepmother stormed after him, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Put her down. She's mine to deal with. She's lazy, always fainting, making a scene." But the words no longer held the same force. The villagers had heard enough, seen enough. The preacher stepped forward, his hand raised, his voice clear. "This child is not lazy. She is starving." The words hung in the air, undeniable. The rancher turned, his eyes burning with a steady fire. "No child should live like this," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a hammer. Striking iron, the stepmother sputtered, but she found fewer eyes meeting hers now. Mothers drew their children close, fathers frowned, neighbors muttered. The blacksmith spoke aloud, his voice booming. "We've watched too long. This ends here." The girl's head rested weakly against the rancher's shoulder. She was too tired to speak, too faint to protest. But she felt the shift in the room, the way the villagers looked at her, not with judgment, but with sorrow and anger. For the first time in so long, she was no longer invisible. The stepmother tried again, her tone sharper. "She's mine by law. You've no right," but the preacher cut her off. "By law, perhaps. But by God's eyes, mercy stands above cruelty, and we will not turn away." The rancher carried the girl out into the square, the villagers following. His children came running from the wagon, their eyes wide with worry. He set the girl gently on a bench, covering her shoulders with his coat. His eldest son pressed an apple into her hands, and she looked at it as if she had forgotten what food was. Slowly, she raised it to her lips. That single bite changed everything. The stepmother shrieked that she would not allow it, that they were stealing from her, but no one moved to help her. The spell of silence that had bound the village was broken. Neighbors stood together, voices rising in agreement. They would not let her starve again. In the days that followed, the stepmother's hold crumbled. She shouted, threatened, but her words rang hollow now. The preacher went to the town council, And though laws were slow to bend, the pressure of the community was stronger. The girl was placed under the care of the rancher and his children, at least until the council could decide. By then, no one doubted where she belonged. The rancher's home changed with her arrival. At first, she was quiet, shy, uncertain of her place. She helped with chores silently, afraid of being scolded for the smallest mistake. But the rancher's children welcomed her, showing her where the blankets were kept, teaching her the rhythm of life on the ranch. The youngest girl offered her half of a biscuit at supper one night, and the rancher watched as the orphan's eyes filled with tears before she dared to accept it. Weeks passed, and color slowly returned to her cheeks. Her frame filled out, her hands grew steadier. Her laughter, quiet at first, began to echo through the halls. She learned to brush the horses, to gather eggs, to help stir the pot of stew without fear of being struck. She grew close to the eldest boy, who had always left food for her in secret. She told him one night by the fire that she had found every apple, every crust, and that it had kept her alive. His face reddened, but his eyes shone with pride. The villagers watched the change too. When she walked through town now, she no longer carried herself like a shadow. She stood straighter, her eyes lifted. People greeted her by name, offering smiles instead of whispers. The preacher spoke of her in sermons, not by name, but as a reminder that mercy must be lived, not just spoken. The blacksmith stopped her once to hand her a small horseshoe charm, saying it was for luck. The stepmother, bitter and unyielding, eventually left the village. Some said she went to live with distant kin, others that she drifted from place to place. Few cared to know. The shadow she cast over the girl's life was finally gone, and no one mourned her absence. The rancher, though, carried the weight of what had happened. At night, when the fire burned low, he thought of how long it had taken him to act, how many times he had held back when he should have stepped forward. His late wife's memory came to him, not in reproach, but in quiet reminder. He had finally done what she would have wanted, though it had taken time. He promised himself he would never wait so long again. The girl herself carried scars deeper than anyone could see. Some nights she still woke in fear, her stomach twisting as if expecting hunger. But each morning, when she found food waiting and kindness surrounding her, the fear softened a little more. She began to dream again, not just of survival, but of a future. She spoke shyly once of wanting to teach younger children to read, to give them what she had been denied. The rancher listened, nodding, and promised she would have every chance. Spring came at last, the snow melting into streams that carried away the remnants of winter. The rancher's land bloomed with green, calves ran in the pasture, and the girl walked with his children, laughter ringing freely. She still carried the memory of her stepmother's cruelty, but it no longer defined her. She had found another life, one built on warmth instead of cold, kindness instead of hunger. The villagers, too, carried the lesson. They spoke often of that day in the square, of how silence had nearly cost a life. And when new troubles arose in the village, as they always did, people remembered not to look away. The preacher's words stayed with them, mercy above cruelty. The rancher sometimes stood at the gate where she had once appeared on that twilight evening, clutching her basket, afraid to step inside. He would look down the road and remember how close she had come to slipping away. Then he would turn back toward the house where her laughter mixed with his children's, and feel a peace settle over him. The story of the cruel stepmother and the starving girl became part of the village's memory. But more than cruelty, people remembered the moment when one act of kindness became the turning point. They remembered the rancher who opened his home, the children who shared their food, the neighbors who found their voices at last. For the girl, it was the beginning of a new chapter. She no longer walked with her head bowed. She no longer feared each mistake. She no longer wondered if she would see another spring. She had found family, not by blood, but by choice, and that was enough to carry her forward. And so the valley, once silent with snow and shadows, filled again with life and hope. The cruel stepmother's voice faded into the past, replaced by the sound of laughter, the smell of warm bread, and the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. The girl, once starved for every mistake, now thrived in a home where mistakes were only lessons, and where every meal was a reminder that kindness, once given, can change everything. In the end, the village did not remember the hunger as much as they remembered the moment it ended. They remembered how close they had come to losing a child and how they chose, finally, to act. And they carried that lesson with them, knowing that silence in the face of cruelty was its own form of cruelty. The rancher, his children, and the girl lived on, not without hardship, for life on the plains was never easy, but with something stronger binding them together. They carried forward with gratitude, with resilience, and with a quiet vow never to let such suffering take root again. The story closed not with the cruelty that began it, but with the kindness that overcame it. And that was the memory that endured, passed from voice to voice whenever the winds howled through the valley and people gathered close to the fire, telling tales of the days when silence was broken and mercy prevailed, top of form, bottom of form.